It was the spring of 1942. The Pacific was burning. After the devastating loss at Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy faced a grim reality. The Japanese Imperial Navy dominated the seas. But while the surface fleets clashed in daylight, another war began to unfold in the darkness below. Beneath the turquoise expanse of the Coral Sea, a handful of American submarines slipped quietly into enemy waters. Their mission: to wage an invisible war. The Coral Sea, stretching between Australia, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, became a critical crossroads of the Pacific campaign. As Japan advanced southward, threatening Australia itself, the U.S. Navy recognized the need to intercept Japanese supply lines. Yet, few knew that before the famed carrier battle in May 1942, American submarines were already patrolling its depths, marking targets and risking lives in complete secrecy. Among the first was USS S-44, an aging S-class submarine launched in the early 1920s. Its hull creaked under the pressure of deep dives, and its torpedoes were notorious for malfunctioning. But its crew, led by Lieutenant Commander John R. Moore, understood the stakes. "We're not just chasing ships," Moore wrote in his patrol log, "we're chasing shadows, trying to stop a tide with a knife." His words reflected the desperation and courage of a Navy still reeling from early defeats. Operating from Brisbane and later Townsville, these submarines were part of what naval intelligence called Operation Southwest Watch. Their orders were blunt: observe, report, and, when possible, disrupt Japanese convoys supplying Rabaul and La. But radio silence was absolute. Any transmission risked detection by Japanese direction-finding stations. That silence became a haunting symbol of their isolation. Once submerged, they were alone in every sense. Conditions aboard were brutal. Inside the narrow, diesel-scented tubes, temperatures soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Fresh water was rationed. Sweat soaked through uniforms that couldn't be washed for weeks. The constant hum of engines and the faint ticking of depth gauges were their only reminders of time. And yet, despite the misery, morale held. The men knew they were the unseen vanguard of America's counteroffensive. In April 1942, USS Greenling was ordered to patrol near the Louisiade archipelago. The crew reported several Japanese freighters escorted by destroyers, but when they fired, their torpedoes either missed or failed to detonate. Faulty magnetic exploders, a problem that plagued U.S. subs until late 1943, rendered many attacks ineffective. Each failure was a risk. Every missed shot revealed their position. The Greenling spent hours under depth charge attack, its hull shuddering as explosions rolled overhead. When it finally surfaced, the men found fragments of the paint peeled off the bulkheads. Despite limited success, these early patrols gathered vital intelligence. The submarines identified new shipping routes, charted reef formations, and tracked Japanese troop movements. This data would later help shape Allied operations in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. But at the time, their work went unnoticed, buried beneath the headlines of larger battles. A secret memorandum from Commander Charles Lockwood, later known as Uncle Charlie, to his submarine crews, described their purpose. "The Coral Sea is the hinge of the Pacific. Hold it, and we hold the line to Australia. Lose it, and we lose everything south of Hawaii." His foresight was chillingly accurate. Japanese expansion threatened to cut off the Allied lifeline to the southern hemisphere. By late April, intelligence suggested a major Japanese operation forming near Rabaul, a strike force aimed at capturing Port Moresby. The submarines were ordered to remain hidden, observe fleet movements, and relay information if possible. But when the enemy convoys began moving, transmissions from several U.S. submarines abruptly stopped. Whether due to radio malfunction or destruction at sea, no one knew. What remained were partial logs, ending mid-sentence. Sighted convoy. Position uncertain. Proceeding to intercept. That was the final entry in one submarine's journal, later recovered from Navy archives. These disappearances were officially listed as operational losses. Yet some officers suspected deeper causes: navigational errors in the reef-choked waters, torpedo explosions upon launch, or silent collisions with uncharted seamounts. Others hinted that Japanese forces had captured intelligence suggesting U.S. subs were nearby, prompting aggressive anti-submarine sweeps. Whatever the truth, it remained buried under layers of wartime secrecy. The submarines of the Coral Sea were the Navy's ghosts, operating without recognition, beyond communication, beneath a sea that offered no mercy. Each patrol carried the unspoken understanding that they might never return. Their silence was both their weapon and their shroud. As May approached, the tension mounted. The Japanese strike fleet was moving south, and the world would soon witness the first carrier battle in history, the Battle of the Coral Sea. But few would know that, long before aircraft took to the skies, a hidden war had already begun below. The men beneath the waves had drawn the first invisible line of defense. Their story, though largely untold, set the stage for what came next, a confrontation that would change naval warfare forever. In the shadow of the Coral Sea's sunlit surface, the submariners continued their lonely war. It was May 1942, and the outcome of the Pacific Campaign hung in the balance. While the world's attention turned to carrier operations and dogfights high above the ocean, the silent service, the U.S. Navy's submariners, were executing some of the most dangerous missions of the war. Their battlefield was invisible, their enemy relentless, and their sacrifices largely unknown. The aging S-class submarines were among the first to venture into the Coral Sea. These boats, relics of World War I, were ill-suited for the tropical environment and for the long-range patrols demanded by the Pacific's vastness. USS S-44, USS S-37, and USS Greenling were slow, noisy, and vulnerable. Yet they were all the Navy had in early 1942, before the more advanced Gato-class boats could be deployed in significant numbers. Each patrol began the same way, a tense departure from Brisbane or Townsville, engines rumbling, officers standing silently on deck as the Australian coast disappeared over the horizon. Within days, they entered enemy-controlled waters where Japanese patrol aircraft, destroyers, and submarines prowled constantly. Their orders were clear but limited: gather intelligence, attack enemy shipping if possible, and survive. Few expected glory, most simply hoped to return. USS Greenling's second patrol, in late April, illustrates the near-impossible conditions they faced. Commanded by Lieutenant Commander H.C. Pound, the submarine was tasked with observing the Louisiade Archipelago, a narrow choke point between New Guinea and the Coral Sea where Japanese supply ships were known to pass. But visibility was poor, and radar was non-existent. The crew relied on periscope sightings and instinct. They endured days submerged in stifling heat, their air thick with diesel fumes and sweat. When Greenling finally sighted a small Japanese convoy, the crew scrambled to attack. The first torpedo malfunctioned, its magnetic exploder arming prematurely and detonating halfway to the target. The shockwave nearly crippled the submarine. The second torpedo ran too deep and passed harmlessly beneath the transport ship. Within moments, Japanese destroyers charged in. For 8 hours, depth charges pounded the sea. Each explosion rattled teeth and shook bolts loose from the hull. "Every man on board was certain it was our last hour," recalled one crewman in a post-war interview. "You could hear the hull flexing like an old tin can." They survived, barely. When Greenling surfaced after dark, its radio antenna was gone, and one of its ballast tanks was cracked. The attack had failed, but its intelligence reports on shipping movements proved invaluable. The data was transmitted through coded channels to Naval Command at Pearl Harbor, confirming that the Japanese were reinforcing Rabaul and preparing an operation aimed at Port Moresby. Those messages helped trigger the deployment of Task Force 17, Admiral Fletcher's carrier group, and would directly influence the coming Battle of the Coral Sea. Elsewhere, USS S-44, commanded by Lieutenant Commander John R. Moore, reported several sightings of Japanese ships but withheld attack due to unfavorable position. The truth was harsher. With defective torpedoes and unreliable depth-keeping mechanisms, every shot was a gamble. A premature explosion or circular run could mean death. The men's frustration grew with each failed engagement, yet their discipline never wavered. "We're fighting both the enemy and our own equipment," Moore wrote in his log, dated May 3, 1942. "But either way, we keep fighting." Meanwhile, USS Grampus and USS Tautog patrolled north of the Coral Sea, shadowing Japanese carrier movements. Their periscope sightings were among the first indications that the Japanese intended to deploy carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku southward. Still, few in the command structure realized how close the two sides were to colliding. When the main battle erupted on May 4th, the submariners below the waves could hear the faint tremors of distant explosions through the water. Torpedo bombers roared overhead, unseen but audible even in the deep. They were witnesses to a new kind of naval warfare, one dominated by air power, but their mission didn't end with observation. They were ordered to locate damaged enemy ships attempting to retreat north. USS Greenling and S-44 both attempted intercepts but found only debris, oil slicks, and drifting lifeboats. And then, something unexpected happened. Several submarines recorded unidentified sonar contacts, large, slow-moving objects deep below the surface. Believing them to be enemy submarines, they prepared to engage, but the contacts vanished without explanation. Later, Japanese records revealed no submarines were in those grid coordinates. The mystery has never been fully explained. Some suggest thermal layers and false echoes confused the early sonar systems. Others wonder if American submarines encountered wreckage from the aerial battle sinking slowly to the seabed. Whatever the cause, those anomalies were quietly omitted from official reports. As May ended, the submarines returned one by one to their Australian bases, battered but alive. Their contributions were not celebrated in headlines, but among the submarine service, word spread, the Coral Sea had been a proving ground. They had faced Japan's expanding empire with outdated boats, broken weapons, and sheer resolve, and survived. Still, their commanders knew the fight was far from over. In the months to come, these same submarines would be sent even deeper into enemy territory, where the dangers multiplied and the losses began to mount. Some would never return. Their missions, still shrouded in secrecy, would vanish from wartime records altogether. The hidden war beneath the Coral Sea was only beginning. And soon, its cost would become painfully clear. May 1942. Above the waves, aircraft carriers were rewriting the rules of naval warfare. Below them, in the silent blue world of the Coral Sea, submariners waged their own desperate struggle. They could not see the planes that filled the sky, but they could feel the concussions of bombs and torpedoes echoing through the depths. The Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval engagement fought entirely by aircraft, was underway. Yet for the submarines beneath, it was a different kind of battle. One fought in darkness, secrecy, and isolation. The U.S. Navy's submarines had been ordered to form a reconnaissance screen stretching from the Louisiade archipelago to the southern approaches of New Guinea. Their mission was to shadow Japanese fleets and report positions to the surface commanders. USS Grampus, S-44, and Greenling were among them. They were not to attack unless a clear opportunity presented itself. Every word of radio transmission carried the risk of detection, and a single transmission could betray a submarine's position to the enemy. The Grampus, commanded by Lieutenant Commander John R. Craig, took position near the Jomard Passage, a narrow channel that Japanese invasion convoys were expected to transit on their way to Port Moresby. On May 6th, Craig recorded a chilling entry in his patrol log: multiple propeller noises detected. At least 4 ships, likely destroyers, escorting transports. Unable to raise periscope due to aerial patrols. Remaining submerged. The entry ends abruptly. For 3 days, there are no further reports. Only later did naval intelligence confirm that Japanese destroyers Arashio and Asashio were sweeping the same area with depth charges. Craig's crew survived, but their narrow escape cost them critical fuel and oxygen reserves. They surfaced only after nightfall, miles from their assigned position. Meanwhile, USS S-44 patrolled further south. The crew could see faint flashes on the horizon, the carrier aircraft striking each other far above their heads. Their orders were to intercept any damaged ships attempting to retreat. At 2,300 hours on May 8, sonar detected a faint contact, slow-moving, metallic, consistent with a crippled vessel. Commander Moore ordered a cautious approach. But as S-44 closed in, hydrophones picked up multiple high-speed screws, a Japanese destroyer screen. Moore dove hard, just as depth charges began to detonate. The submarine rocked violently, gauges shattered, and a torpedo tube jammed. The attack lasted nearly 2 hours. When the explosions stopped, the ocean fell eerily silent. Moore later wrote, "The enemy was above us, and death was all around. Yet the silence afterward was worse, the kind that makes a man wonder if he's the last one left alive." During the height of the carrier battle, submarines like S-44 and Greenling could only listen. Through the hull, they heard what sounded like distant thunder, the sound of aerial bombs and torpedoes striking ships miles away. For submariners, there was a haunting frustration in being witnesses to a battle they could not join. But their reports were invaluable. Radio intercepts from these boats confirmed that Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku had been damaged, forcing them to withdraw northward. This intelligence reached Admiral Nimitz days later and influenced subsequent decisions in the lead-up to the Battle of Midway. Still, not all submarine reports reached headquarters. Some were intercepted, others never sent. Navy archives reveal fragments of messages that end mid-transmission. One from USS K-16, dated May 10, reads only, "Enemy carrier force observed bearing northeast. Depth charges approaching. Will attempt." The rest was lost. The K-16 never returned. No wreckage was ever found. Its loss was attributed to unknown operational causes, a phrase repeated far too often in the Pacific campaign. Decades later, Australian fishermen claimed to have snagged nets on a large metallic structure southeast of Milne Bay, but no recovery mission ever confirmed the find. After the battle, submarine crews gathered in Australian ports to exchange intelligence. They were gaunt, exhausted, and shaken by what they'd endured. But they also knew they had witnessed history. The Japanese advance toward Port Moresby had been stopped, not by the surface fleet alone, but by the combined courage of those above and below the sea. Yet mystery clung to their missions. Several submarines reported unidentified sonar echoes during and after the battle. Slow-moving, metallic, unidentifiable. One report even described multiple stationary objects suspended in the thermocline layer at 600 feet, which then vanished without trace. Whether these were false readings, debris, or something else, no explanation was ever recorded. Those anomalies disappeared into classified logs marked unconfirmed contact. By late May, with the battle over, the surviving submarines were ordered to continue reconnaissance along the Solomon Islands chain. The Coral Sea was now a graveyard of ships and aircraft, and beneath its calm waters lay the wrecks of those who had fought in silence. The submarines had performed their duty, yet many felt they had only glimpsed a fraction of the true scale of the conflict. The deeper they went, the more secrets the ocean seemed to hold. As Commander Craig later reflected in a letter home, "We fought a battle no one saw, and the sea keeps its own counsel." The Battle of the Coral Sea marked the turning point, but for the submariners who survived it, the war below the surface was far from over. Orders soon came for a new mission, to pursue Japanese shipping lanes northward, toward Rabaul and the Solomons. There, the ocean's silence would grow darker still. June 1942. The Battle of the Coral Sea was over, but for the men who fought beneath its surface, the war had only deepened. As carrier task forces shifted north toward Midway, a handful of American submarines remained behind, their orders vague, their objectives even murkier. Officially, they were tasked with continuing reconnaissance and interdiction in the Coral Sea region. Unofficially, they were part of an effort that would later vanish from most wartime records. USS Grunion, USS Runner, USS S-44, and USS Triton, 4 names whispered among surviving submariners with a mix of pride and unease. Between June and August 1942, these boats patrolled the shipping lanes between Rabaul, Bougainville, and the Solomons. Japanese supply convoys moved almost nightly, protected by destroyers and aircraft. Submarines operated alone, often hundreds of miles from support. Their commanders knew the odds of survival were shrinking with every patrol. The Grunion, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Mannert Abel, departed Pearl Harbor in June. Her route took her through the Coral Sea, where she was to gather enemy shipping data and engage targets of opportunity. On July 30th, Grunion transmitted a short message, attacked 2 enemy destroyers near Kiska, expended all torpedoes. returning to base. She was never heard from again. Search aircraft found no trace. Years later, in 2007, her wreck was discovered off the Aleutian Islands, thousands of miles from her last known position. How she came to rest there remains an unsolved enigma, suggesting possible navigational misreporting or misdirection orders deliberately obscured during the war. Meanwhile, in the Coral Sea, USS Runner and USS S-44 continued their silent operations. The Runner, a Gato-class boat under Commander Joseph H. Borland, was assigned to the waters near the Solomon Sea. Japanese records later confirmed that a submarine was attacked and destroyed near the Bismarck Archipelago on June 26, 1943, possibly Runner. But even those records conflict. Some suggest she was sunk by air attack near Hokkaido months later. The Navy listed her as lost due to unknown causes. The mystery of her disappearance has never been conclusively solved. For the crewmen aboard these subs, the dangers were constant. Japanese destroyers used advanced sonar and released depth charge patterns that could crush a submarine's hull like an eggshell. Inside, the men endured the terrifying sound of bulkheads groaning under pressure. "You don't hear explosions so much as you feel them," remembered Torpedoman's mate Jack Best from the S-44. "They roll through your bones. You can taste the seawater in the air." Sleep came only in moments, jolted awake by sudden alarms, hydraulic leaks, or the shriek of steel under stress. Despite the fear, they continued to strike. The S-44 claimed the sinking of a freighter near New Britain in late July, confirmed by post-war Japanese records as the Kawafuku Maru. Yet success brought little comfort. For every victory, a dozen other boats failed to return. The ocean swallowed them without witness, without graves. What troubled naval historians most were the missing logs. Patrol records from mid-1942 to early 1943 show abrupt gaps, entire missions reduced to one-line entries reading, "lost contact," or "no further report." Declassified intelligence from the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, decades later hinted at special operations being carried out in this region. Some involved the insertion of Allied coastwatchers and intelligence officers along the New Guinea coast, missions that required submarines to surface in enemy territory under cover of night. A single miscalculation, a single searchlight beam, could end them all. One such mission, reportedly involving USS Triton, remains shrouded in secrecy. Her patrol log ends with a cryptic line, "Coast operation completed. Enemy response heavier than expected." No further communications were received. The Navy declared her missing, presumed lost, in March 1943. Survivors of Japanese naval units in the area later described recovering wreckage with foreign lettering near the Huon Gulf, possibly Triton's remains, though no confirmation has ever been made. By now, the submariners understood they were not merely fighting a naval war. They were instruments in a broader intelligence campaign, one too delicate for open acknowledgement. In Brisbane, Commander Charles Lockwood issued a terse order to his sub-captains: maintain silence at all costs. Report only success or failure. The rest was left to rumor and interpretation. Many of these men carried their knowledge to the grave. Modern searches of the Coral Sea floor, conducted by Australian and American teams in the early 2000s, have revealed dozens of wrecks, some identifiable, others anonymous. Several match the dimensions of S-class submarines, but corrosion and sediment make confirmation difficult. One wreck, found at a depth of 1,400 meters near the Louisiade Passage, bears what appear to be torpedo tubes matching the runner's configuration. No official identification has been released. For families back home, the losses were unbearable. Telegrams arrived quietly, offering no detail, only the words, "missing in action." Mothers, wives, and children waited for news that never came. The submariners' creed, "run silent, run deep," became tragically literal. They had run deep, too deep for the world to hear them again. As the U.S. fleet celebrated victories at Midway and Guadalcanal, the unseen war beneath the Coral Sea continued without fanfare or recognition. Its heroes remained anonymous, their fates uncertain. The official histories mention them only in passing, footnotes to grander battles fought on the surface. But for those who survived, the memory of their comrades haunted every dive that followed. The Coral Sea had claimed its own, not in the fury of battle, but in silence and secrecy. And as 1943 dawned, new orders arrived that would push the surviving boats into even darker waters. Missions involving intelligence, code recovery, and operations that would test the very limits of secrecy itself. The war beneath the Coral Sea was no longer just hidden. It was vanishing from history. By 1943, the hidden submarine war beneath the Coral Sea had transformed from a campaign of reconnaissance into something far more secretive. The Japanese were fortifying their strongholds across the Solomons, and the Allies were desperate for intelligence. Not just ship movements, but codes, documents, and technology. Submarines became the instruments of this invisible hunt. Their new missions would never be mentioned in official communiques, their patrol logs often rewritten or redacted. Theirs was a war of secrets within the broader war for survival. In February 1943, Commander Charles Lockwood, now in charge of the Submarine Force, Pacific Fleet, authorized what he called Special Assignment Patrols. These operations sent submarines deep into enemy waters, not simply to sink ships but to retrieve intelligence. Some missions targeted downed aircraft carrying codebooks. Others aimed to deliver or recover coast watchers, Allied intelligence agents who lived for months behind enemy lines, observing Japanese movements along New Guinea's northern coast. The submarine's involvement in these clandestine operations would remain classified for decades. USS Gudgeon was one such boat. Departing Brisbane under radio silence, she carried a small team of Australian coastwatchers and a handful of American OSS operatives. Their orders: to infiltrate the La Salamaua region and establish a forward observation post. On the night of February 28, Gudgeon surfaced along the Huon Gulf in enemy-controlled waters. A tropical storm provided cover. The team slipped ashore under darkness, their footsteps swallowed by rain and surf. The submarine waited offshore for 48 hours, ready to recover them if detected. When Gudgeon returned 3 nights later, there was no signal. No flares. No sound. The men were never seen again. Such missions blurred the line between naval warfare and espionage. In one declassified ONI report dated May 1943, an unnamed submarine captain described receiving an urgent insertion order for the coast of Bougainville. His orders came not through normal Navy channels but via encrypted OSS communication. Observe without engagement, the directive read. Report on installations, movements, and radio traffic. No offensive action. The instruction baffled many in the submarine service, trained to attack, not observe. Yet those who followed such orders often disappeared. USS Runner was among them. Her final patrol began in May 1943. She was last heard from transmitting a routine weather report near the Bismarck Archipelago. Post-war Japanese documents mention anti-submarine operations in that same area, yet no conclusive record of her sinking has ever surfaced. When her loss was reported, Naval Command released only a single statement: Runner presumed lost. Mission details classified. Even decades later, much of her patrol documentation remains redacted. Among surviving crewmen from neighboring patrols, rumors spread of silent assignments. These were believed to involve code recovery, efforts to retrieve Japanese cipher materials from sunken ships or coastal stations. Some submariners claimed to have seen fragments of enemy communication gear hauled aboard their decks before being transferred under heavy security to Australian intelligence officers. Others recalled carrying sealed crates labeled "restricted," contents unknown. None of these accounts can be fully verified, yet multiple sources suggest coordination between the U.S. Navy and British code-breaking efforts at Bletchley Park. If true, these missions were vital to the eventual cracking of Japanese naval ciphers in 1944. Amid the mystery, morale within the submarine force grew strained. The stress of prolonged isolation, compounded by the knowledge that many missions would never be acknowledged, took a heavy toll. Crewmen were forbidden to keep detailed diaries, yet some did so secretly. One recovered fragment, attributed to a crewman of USS Scamp, reads, "We go where we're told, and we see things we're not allowed to speak of. Sometimes I think the silence is worse than the fear." Another, from a post-war memoir by Lieutenant J.G. Robert Kershaw, described strange orders received off Milne Bay to trail a Japanese hospital ship without engagement. He later wrote, "We were told it was for observation only, but no one understood why. When we returned, that patrol was erased from our log." The atmosphere of secrecy extended to Naval Command itself. Intelligence memos from the era show inconsistencies, patrol zones overlapping, timelines conflicting, mission designations missing. Even Admiral Lockwood later admitted in his memoir, Sink 'em All, that certain patrols were conducted whose purpose was not disclosed even to theater command. Historians now believe these may have involved early coordination with the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, ASIS, and the Allied Intelligence Bureau, AIB, organizations whose archives remain largely sealed. As 1943 wore on, the number of submarines missing in the Coral Sea and adjacent waters rose sharply. In just 6 months, 5 U.S. boats vanished: Runner, Grampus, Amberjack, Triton, and Grayling. Some were almost certainly lost to enemy action, but others seemed simply to disappear. No distress calls. No wrecks found. Only silence. That silence bred speculation among those who survived. Some believed that navigational failures had led the subs into uncharted reefs. Others whispered of friendly fire, Allied aircraft mistaking them for Japanese. A few suspected deliberate obfuscation, that certain boats had been sent on deniable missions, their records altered or destroyed once completed. The truth remains entangled in layers of secrecy that even time has not fully unraveled. By the end of 1943, as the Allied advance turned toward the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, many of these special operations were quietly discontinued. The surviving submarines were reassigned to open combat patrols. Yet the legacy of those months, of lost boats, redacted missions, and unanswered questions, still lingers in naval archives. When historians look back on the Coral Sea campaign, they see the aircraft carriers, the dogfights, the surface battles. Few remember the men who fought beneath the waves, under orders they barely understood, risking everything for missions history would almost forget. They left behind no monuments, only whispers, and the soundless graves of their boats resting in the dark. Still, the classified files hint at one final chapter, the discovery of wartime documents decades later, revealing that even in the war's closing years, the Coral Sea remained a theater of secret operations, a place where the line between fact and disappearance blurred completely. The Coral Sea today seems peaceful, a tranquil expanse of blue stretching between Australia and the Solomon Islands. But beneath its calm surface lie steel tombs and stories that have yet to be fully told. The hidden submarine war fought here between 1942 and 1944 remains one of the most obscure and haunting chapters in naval history. Its wrecks, lost patrol logs, and missing men still whisper of missions erased by time, or perhaps deliberately buried in secrecy. When the war finally turned in the Allies' favor, attention shifted north toward the Philippines, the Marianas, and Japan itself. The Coral Sea, once the front line, became a backwater in official reports. But in the shadows of victory, naval intelligence quietly continued to investigate the fates of missing submarines. Recovery teams, aided by Australian divers and local fishermen, scoured reefs and deep channels for signs of the Runner, Grampus, and Triton. They found fragments, twisted steel, torpedo casings, pieces of deck plating, but never the full story. In 1946, the Office of Naval Intelligence compiled a classified report titled Submarine Losses in the Southwest Pacific. Much of it remains redacted, even today. What is legible paints a chilling picture. Several boats reported receiving new mission codes shortly before disappearing. Others transmitted partial signals that seemed to contradict their assigned patrol areas. One submarine, believed to be the Grayling, was reportedly sighted by an Australian patrol aircraft hundreds of miles from her declared position, heading northeast, into waters she had no reason to enter. The pilot filed a report, but it vanished from official archives soon after. Throughout the late 1940s, debriefings of surviving submarine captains hinted at orders so secret that even senior fleet officers were unaware of them. These included operations to recover Japanese code materials, to extract Allied agents trapped in New Guinea, and, most mysteriously, to investigate foreign wreckage of interest reported by coastwatchers in the Coral Sea. The phrasing is curious: foreign wreckage, not enemy. Some historians believe this referred to crashed aircraft or experimental technology. Others argue it may have simply been a bureaucratic euphemism for ships destroyed in battle. Yet no material evidence was ever logged or photographed. What remains beyond dispute is the cost. By war's end, 52 U.S. submarines had been lost in the Pacific. At least 9 of those were operating in or near the Coral Sea. Their total complement, more than 800 men, were never recovered. Families received terse letters of condolence, their loved ones' names engraved on memorials at Pearl Harbor and Manila, but no explanation of where or how they died. To this day, some wreck sites have never been found. In the decades that followed, civilian researchers began to revisit the Coral Sea mysteries. The advent of deep-sea sonar in the 1980s revealed anomalies: long, narrow structures scattered across the seafloor between the Louisiade Archipelago and the Solomon Sea. Some measured the exact dimensions of early U.S. S-class submarines. Others seemed to bear markings consistent with Japanese escort ships. The depths, however, made exploration difficult. Many of these anomalies remain untouched, their stories sealed in darkness 2 miles below. In 2007, an expedition led by the Able family finally located the wreck of USS Grunion off the Aleutian Islands, thousands of miles from where she was thought to have been lost. The discovery solved one mystery but deepened others. Why had her last known transmission placed her near New Guinea? Some theorize clerical errors or message misrouting. Others suspect deliberate falsification to conceal sensitive orders. The truth may never be known. Even today, parts of the Coral Sea remain closed to deep-sea exploration due to unexploded ordnance and sensitive military zones. When modern ROVs have descended into these waters, they found only silence, a world of coral-encrusted debris, twisted metal, and the faint outlines of what were once proud ships. A few artifacts, a brass compass, a torpedo loading hatch, fragments of hull numbers, have been recovered and quietly archived at the Australian War Memorial. Each one tells a piece of a much larger story. Yet beyond the documents, beyond the data, there is something more human that lingers: the sense of unseen valor. The submariners of the Coral Sea fought without recognition, their successes unheralded, their losses unexplained. They endured claustrophobic dives, relentless enemy hunts, and the crushing pressure of both water and secrecy. Their courage helped turn the tide of the Pacific War, even if their names never reached the headlines. As one surviving officer, Commander Robert Kershaw, reflected years later, "They told us our job was to vanish, to leave no trace. We did that better than anyone expected." His words capture the essence of this hidden conflict. Beneath the Coral Sea lies not only wreckage, but the silence of men who served unseen, whose war was fought in darkness, whose victories were unrecorded, whose deaths remain unconfirmed. Today, historians continue to piece together fragments from declassified files, sonar images, and oral histories. Each discovery brings the story a little closer to the light, but the full truth, the scope of the missions, the orders behind them, and the reasons for their disappearance, remains elusive. The ocean keeps its secrets well. The hidden U.S. submarine war beneath the Coral Sea was more than a military campaign. It was a struggle against both an enemy and the weight of secrecy itself. It reminds us that history's greatest mysteries are not always about what we can see, but about what remains deliberately unseen, resting in silence, far below the waves.